Welcome along to Obsession Engineering for the start of another project. Those who've watched before will know we've been doing Henry's Honda recently. That got delivered yesterday, which means the project bench is empty. And to fill it, a few weeks ago I went and bought a new toy. For myself, I've got a 1998 Yamaha R1. A few years ago, my best mate and trusted mechanic Andy acquired this R1 when they weren't worth a totally large amount, and it had a lot of period correct items on it. It had rim mounted brakes, it had Harris rear sets, it had a few unpleasant bits, it had wheels that were powder coated white with red centres. His girlfriend did refer to them correctly as period wheels. But about 4 years ago Andy decided to have a bit of a crack at it, and he's restored almost all of the bike. He's also got, which he's given me in the deal, a brand new set of fairings, well, a brand new top fairing and seat unit and some second-hand side panels, and a smattering of other pleasantries. So I have almost everything to put this bike together. Andy had also had the engine out of it, he'd replaced the head gasket, he'd been through almost all of the bike. He'd had the suspension refurbished. He's made a very, very nice job of it. And then, for one reason or other, ran out of time, money and motivation, and the bike's sort of been languishing for a bit, which is really easy to happen with a project. So a couple of weeks ago he mentioned it to me and I went and snapped his hand off for it. So we've still got period correct Öhlins forks, a period correct Öhlins shock and an open pipe, so it actually sounds properly like a motorbike. The rest of it is almost entirely standard 1998 R1, and all I've got to really do is get it running again and put it back together, which should be fairly straightforward. So after a few days of inactivity while I did things that actually pay for me to have toys, I've decided the best place to start is to actually try and make it start. It's going to be fairly straightforward, hopefully, because Andy, being the good mechanic he is, probably ran it out of fuel, so the carbs should be fairly clean. The fuel tank is definitely clean, so I'm just going to whip the fuel tank off, take the airbox off, pull the carbs off, put them on the bench and take the float bolt and bits off and make sure they actually are clean inside. And if they are, I shall pop them back on, rig up a dummy fuel tank to it, and see if we can make it be alive. These things are pretty simple to work on. Tank comes off nice and easily because it wasn't really attached. Then it's the top of the airbox off, bottom of the airbox is just on with a couple of clamps, and then it's onto the carbs. They can be a little bit fiddly, there's just a few little pipes and clamps and bits. Choke cable and the throttle cables are also a little bit of a faff, but it's easy to take the throttle cables off at the throttle, then just feed it off, stick some rag in the holes and off we go. So now I have the carburetors off the bike and on the bench, and in a tray, so when we turn them upside down a bit, if there is any fuel left in them, it doesn't go across the bench. All I'm going to do is whip the float bowls off, take out the main jets and the pilot jets, give them a good clean, and have a general check of the condition. If they're really horrible, we'll ultrasonic them, but hopefully they won't be too bad. The float bowl screws can be quite tight, so make sure you've got a really well fitted screwdriver, little bit of pressure on it, and they should come apart. So now I have the float bowls off, which were completely empty, which is always a good sign. I'm just going to whip out the pilot jets and the main jets, one at a time, make sure they're nice and clear before I pop everything back together. I will of course double check the float bowl seals are okay, because we don't want to pour fuel all over the bike. So this is the pilot jet. As you can see, it's got little holes at the bottom and a really, really little hole straight down the middle, which you may or may not be able to see on the camera. And I just want to make sure all of those are clear. The main jets are sort of a similar idea, but they're much bigger holes. So the pilot jet's the really important one for actually getting the bike to start. So I'm just going to make sure all the holes are nice and clear, pop everything back together. This main jet has brought out the emulsion tube with it. The main jet is perfectly clear, you can actually just about see down there, but you can also see along here some absolutely tiny little holes. Now, if you had left old fuel in the bike and it's gone off, it bungs those holes up really quite easily, and that's really when you need to do a proper strip down and ideally ultrasonic the carburetors. But Andy is an excellent mechanic, and being the excellent mechanic he is, he emptied the fuel out of the carbs, so we're not going to have that problem. Hopefully, we won't have any problems at all. Refitting the carbs is a reverse of the removal process. Yeah, right! They can be a little bit tight to go on the inlet rubbers, but with a little bit of persuasion and a little bit of lube they'll go on. Then it's a case of reconnecting all the little clamps that hold them to the engine, refitting the throttle cables and the pipes and bits like that, and then when they're all connected you can actually go on and refit the airbox, which is considerably easier. Now that the carburetors are refitted, I decided it was time to actually try and get the engine to turn over, which would generally involve some electricity. So I've fitted a brand new little Alliant lithium battery. For years I used Shorei's, which were excellent quality, but the prices kept going up and the trade discount kept going down. So now I'm using Alliant, which are also excellent. They've got protection circuits in them and bits so they don't set fire to themselves, which is always useful. And compared to the original Yamaha battery, it's half the size and about a quarter of the weight. So that is, you know, an easy advantage. Then I realised when I first turned the ignition on that nothing happened on the clocks. And that was because this bit of the loom was sat in the box of spares. So now we actually have life in the clocks. There is some fault code because some bits aren't connected, but we have some life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spin it over on the starter a little bit to get some oil around it, and then I'm going to add some petrol into an offset tank, open that up, get some fuel into the carbs, and see if we can make fire. So I've already been spinning the bike over a little bit just on the starter to get a little bit of oil around it. Yamaha's run an oil level light, not an oil pressure light, so I've just been looking in the sight glass instead to make sure the level's dropping. So I'm happy that we've got some oil around the bike. I now have my colostomy bag full of fuel. I primed the system up a little bit, so now we'll see if it actually works. I didn't really expect it to go first time. Well, I'm fairly sure the smoke coming off it is just bits of sort of debris and dirt off the header pipes, but I'm just going to turn it off, give everything a minute for the levels to reset, have a bit of a look round to make sure it is alright, and then we'll have another go. So I've checked its levels and the oil was a little bit low, so I've topped it up with admittedly some slightly different oil because I don't have the same grade that Andy put in it. But it'll be alright for just running it up for now. It will get an oil change later because the oil in it is sort of 4 or 5 years old. But I'm just really pleased it actually ran the first time. It isn't setting fire to itself as far as I can tell, so I'm just going to run it up, get a bit more temperature into it, and, you know, let it cycle everything around itself and generally enjoy being alive. And of course I've got the fan on now so that I don't die. So it does at least run again. Little bit harder to start because the plugs were probably a bit damp that time. And now it's been running a little bit. There's just a minor little oil leak from a bolt hole on the other side. So I'm just going to have a bit of a look at that and then see if we can run it up to temperature a bit further. So there is currently an oil leak straight out of that bolt hole, which is a little bit strange because I don't imagine that bolt hole's supposed to go straight into the motor. So I wonder if at some point somebody's maybe put a bolt in that's too long and popped the casting the other side. I'm not sure, and I will check later on the workshop manual, but for now what I'm going to do is put a bolt in it with a copper washer underneath it so it seals, so that I can run it up a little bit longer. So I fitted a bolt with a copper washer behind it because there's definitely not meant to be oil coming out of that hole. I think what's probably happened at some point is somebody's wound a bolt in that's just a little bit too long and cracked the casting behind the bolt hole. But it shouldn't really cause us any problems as long as there's not oil coming out. So bolt is in, that will stop that leaking. The other things I've noticed while we're messing around is this is the alternator wiring and it's supposed to be connected into there. So another day I will connect that back up. I think what's happened is when Andy took the engine out to do the head gasket, this connector is sort of seized and I suspect slightly melted together. So what I'll probably do is just add a little bit of length into the cabling and wire it straight to the cables and not have a connector in there, so it gets rid of a weak point in the system. The clocks, if my camera will actually go and look at those, are having a little bit of a moment to themselves and going a bit mental. That fault code is that the fuel tank is not connected, which is fairly accurate. When it runs, they have a bit of a tendency to go a little bit wappy and turn on and off. Not entirely sure what the problem is with that, but when I rooted through the box a bit, there is actually a spare set of clocks, so it's not really the end of the world. So now that we don't have that oil leak, I'm going to get it running again and see if we can get a little bit more temperature and heat into it. The smoke you can see coming off it now is the exit valve, because Andy's probably quite heavily greased it. He's painted that into the exhaust pipe so it will, survive a little bit longer. So it's just burning off that sort of the unpleasantness of that. So I'm not too worried. There's no oil on the bench this time, which is a distinct advantage. And all I've done so far is just tweak the tick over up so it actually runs quite nicely. And there we go. The first day on a project and the bike's actually running. It's a miracle! Now that it's been running for a while, I've had it running long enough for the fan to cut in and out a couple of times. Everything's, not leaking on the bench anymore. The clocks, other than it telling me the fuel tank is disconnected, are happy. I'm actually getting a temperature reading a bit. And it sounds tickety-boo! Happy days, oh happy days. So far I'm incredibly happy with how it's going, because it's day one and I've got a bike running. And then I thought, do you know what, before I go home, I'll just have a little look round and see what other little jobs need doing. Write out a bit of a to-do list. So I thought I needed to fit a front sprocket nut, which I then found in a bag and fitted. And the next thing I thought was, probably ought to really put a swinging arm pivot bolt nut on. So I rooted around in the box and found this. Now this would have originally been holding on a crash mushroom, which I don't want to refit because I don't like them, because if you fall off, they smash your ankle to pieces. Small price to pay and all that, potentially, but there you go. But interestingly, it still has a socket in it, and the nut is wedged in there as well. So I'm kind of guessing Andy's tapped a socket in there to get it out, and then can't get the socket back out of the holder. So I'm going to give it all a little bit of a wiggle, see if I can free it all off, and I may have also won a free socket. It's the gift that keeps giving, this bike. Blooming brilliant. We've won a nut, a washer that actually are in quite pleasant condition, a free socket, and a piece of aluminium that I'll probably use for hitting something with a hammer later. But excellent, I'm going to fit this, torque it all up, then that'll probably do for today. So I think that'll do for the first proper day on the R1. It runs, which is a massive plus because it's always a bit of a punt. It runs really nicely, which is an absolute bonus. It no longer leaks on the floor, which is another bonus. And I've managed to get a free 27mm socket. It is an excellent day, really. I've got a bit of a plan for next time. I'm going to change all the fluids in it, put some brakes on it, because it now can move. It probably ought to really be able to stop it. The calipers and brake lines and everything are in a box, so they are good to go. So yeah, that'll do for today. Thanks for watching, and join me again next time for some more R1 action.